Functioning and self-determination. Dr. Parker is a post-secondary disability specialist and an ADD life coach. He's the author of numerous research articles and books. He's the executive director of the Journal of Post-Secondary Education and Disability. So kindly welcome Dr. David Parker.
We're all set here then. Good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me all right? Okay. Forgive me for not speaking Arabic, but I'll do my best when we interact, and we'll try and get everybody's questions heard and answered as clearly as possible. It is a great privilege to be here. I've been fortunate enough in the past to travel to many places: Japan, Austria, Italy, the United Kingdom, Ireland. This is my first trip to the Middle East, however, and it's just been an extraordinary experience. And what better country than Kuwait to first experience the Middle East? I want to thank my host, Mrs. Amal Al-Sayer, and Dr. Huda, and Dr. Bir, who's here as well, and all the board members of KALD. I have worked for a number of organizations over the years. I've never seen such a collaborative group of caring parents, professionals, individuals making change so rapidly. So I had been interested in learning more about the work of KALD before coming over here, and then meeting people and seeing the passion and the intelligence and the caring for the students that are the central reason why we're here has made a lot of sense and inspired me. I'm going to go home with a lot of hope in my heart. So again, thank you for your warm welcome. I also want to thank Dr. Blaise Aguirre, who's been a great colleague and a cultural translator as I've geared up for this trip. And he's a very tough act to follow, so I'm a little nervous about speaking after him. But I'll do my best this afternoon. That's right, that's right. I'll put to use what he's taught me, and I'll be very confident and hopefully be of some help and interest to you. So in preparing 3 talks, the first one today is going to be again about self-determination and executive functioning. And I'll warn you now, it's the most theoretical and research-based of the 3 talks. And I know that I'll be going over a lot of information that many of you are already very familiar with. Sometimes it's helpful just to hear another person explain our knowledge in their own words and with their own examples. So I hope that that holds some interest to you if you're as knowledgeable about this as I'm sure many of you are. I'll also try and be as practical as I can today as well. I'm understanding that there are a lot of educators in the room frustrated because of your desire to work with kids who can be very complicated and very frustrating to work with. If we didn't want to get through, if we didn't want to be effective, if we didn't want to teach them successfully, we probably wouldn't be that frustrated. So I'll try and target my remarks to classroom interventions as much as possible. But today is largely about sort of background knowledge and concepts. I'm giving 2 talks tomorrow that are going to be much more practical, sort of hands-on. One is about ADD coaching, including some of the research that's been done, but also what is coaching? We'll do a little bit of practice with that. And then the 3rd talk will be about other classroom strategies that we can use to help students with executive functioning issues. And that's just very practical and very hands-on. So I hope you'll bear with me as I go from theoretical research to very practical and hands-on over the course of 3 talks.
But the sound is not here for the back.
I'm sorry?
The microphone because of the translator.
Of course.
Whenever you need it, you may use it, but keep it.
Thank you. Thank you.
It is taking your voice echo.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Is that better? Okay. And nobody's left yet, so that's a good sign with the sound here. By way of further introductions, just a little bit of background. So you might know more about questions to ask me given some prior experiences that I've had. I think of myself as an educator. My undergraduate degree is in special education. I taught special education in a public high school in the US where I'm from. I went on to get my master's in counseling because so many of the students with LD and ADHD that I worked with struggled emotionally. I certainly have a better understanding of why that is after Dr. Aguirre's talk today. But I wanted to understand their emotional lives to try and reach them more effectively academically. So I did that for a while. Most of my career has entailed working in different universities in the US with college students with learning disabilities, ADHD, Asperger's, and of course many of those students also had depression, anxiety, and other issues as well. I've worked at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, at Washington University in St. Louis, where I ran a National Science Foundation grant there, and more recently at the University of Connecticut, where, as I said, I went to get my doctorate in special education. Became a faculty member there, so it was a great opportunity to teach as well as run the services for students with LD and ADHD at those universities. As Dr. Huda shared, I'm also currently the executive editor of what's called the Journal of Post-Secondary Education and Disability. And the Association of Higher Education and Disability, AHD, is the group that sponsors that journal. So I'm a researcher, I'm a teacher, I'm an educator. Currently, I'm working in a private clinic in my hometown of Indianapolis, Indiana, called CRG, and that stands for Children's Resource Group. And I have the chance here to work with psychiatrists and psychologists, assistive technology specialists, and other people who do assessments for LD, ADHD, depression, anxiety, provide medication management if people are interested in that, need or want that help. I work with therapists there as well too who are doing psychotherapy. So it's a great opportunity to collaborate with a lot of colleagues where we often treat the same person from different points of view. So that's some of the background and some of the work that I've done. I'm just curious, by a show of hands, how many of you here today are high school or college students? Great, welcome, we're glad that you're here. I love working with college students and high school students, particularly with ADHD. I used to be very frustrated with them because I didn't know how to get through. I thought that if I told them to buy a calendar and color code all their assignments for the entire semester, that my job was done. And that they would look in their calendar every day and see what was coming up and know when to get started and work very methodically over time until their deadlines were due. And I was so wrong about that. And as long as I tried to make them do things the way that I did them, I remained frustrated. So students really have been the biggest educators that I've had, and I'm glad many of you are with us here today. Okay. Quickly, too, if I may, just because I have some really nice technology. That I don't know how to use very well, forgive me. Can we go back to the view? Thank you. Just the full screen. Thank you. I live in the Midwest, Indianapolis. We don't have as much snow and ice as in Boston, but it was lovely to come here too. So if you see the blue lakes at the top of the screen, I'm sorry, I did it again. We're going to skip me showing you where Indiana is. Thank you. On with the show. So what we're going to be talking about today is executive functioning. In the US, the area that I'm most familiar with, until about the mid-1990s, we really didn't have that term. We didn't think about that when we thought about students with LD and ADHD. But that has emerged, at least in my country, as the predominant way of thinking about LD and ADHD. Executive functioning is a concept that we're going to be talking a lot about today, and it is the similarity between LD and ADHD. Students with these disabilities have difficulty with executive functioning. So as we better understand it, as we deliver educational interventions that help students deal with their executive functioning issues, they get happier, they become more successful academically, they develop independent life skills. So that will be our focus here. When you think about executive functioning, you need to think about the prefrontal cortex, the area just behind our forehead, the left and right frontal lobe, if you will. I have a small model of the human brain in my office, and when I'm meeting with students, particularly for the first time, I'll get that out and have them hold it, and we'll talk about the frontal lobes. I'll point to them, and we'll talk about the fact that there's a difference in the neurochemicals that their brains are producing in that part of the brain compared to somebody without LD or ADHD. And it's no fault of their own, and it doesn't mean that they're any less intelligent or less successful. But as they understand that difference in neurochemical production in that part of their brain, they can begin to understand and accept and really forgive themselves for the difficulties that they're having. So it's a little bit of science, not much, but it's factual information that I find even 12, 13, 14-year-olds are interested in. As I was listening to the questions about some of the disruptive students, I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to either sit down with them individually or work with the entire class and show them a brain, talk to them about frontal lobe functioning, talk to them about how lack of sleep or stress or diet can affect the functioning of the frontal lobe for all of us, but particularly if we have LD or ADHD, we can be very sensitive to that. But when you're talking about students who have good executive functioning, they're often the students we love to have in our classroom. These are students who are organized. These are students who turn in their homework. These are students who listen quietly. These are students who wait their turn. These are students who only need to be told once, and then they can remember and carry out our instructions. We all know that students with LD and ADHD, on the other hand, students who often have poor executive functioning, are just the opposite. They have great difficulty being organized. They may need you to repeat directions many times, particularly as they get older and the amount of homework increases. They have great difficulty remembering to do the homework, finding the homework once they've done it, turning it in. I work with a lot of high school students now at CRG, and I try and help them develop better organizational strategies. And one of the most heartbreaking problems that they report frequently is that they do their homework, but they can't find it when it's time to turn it in, or they forget to turn it in. So they've done the work, but they don't get any credit for it because of their disorganization. We know that myelination is the development of basically fatty tissue around our neurons in our brain, that as our brain matures, myelination helps us use our brain more effectively. I also talk about that with students and their parents and teachers if I'm giving workshops to them, to better understand why it's often also a maturational issue with many of these students, meaning that for many of us, myelination doesn't complete itself until we're in our early to mid-20s. And it works from the back of the brain, the most primitive part of our brain, to the front. So the part of our brain, the prefrontal cortex, that's controlling thinking, decision-making, problem-solving, the management of time, all these executive functions, that part of the brain is the last to mature. And for many of the students we're talking about today, that might be a 2 or 3 or 4 year delay in maturation. So the good news is that these students' ability to think critically will often develop effectively over time. The bad news is that it might take 2 or 3 years longer than their peers who don't have these disabilities, okay? So when I'm sharing that information with students, I say to them, we're not talking about a crutch here. We're not talking about an excuse. Just because you have LD or ADHD doesn't mean I won't have very high expectations for you. I know you're very intelligent. I know that you're capable of great things. But if you understand how your brain works and what makes sitting still and having to pay attention, particularly to boring information for a long period of time. Why? Because of the production of neurochemicals in your brain. That's harder for you to do. Then we get to say, in a way, it's really not your fault. But we also begin to understand why that's difficult for you, and more importantly, what you can learn to do about it to be more successful as well, too. Okay? So again, even with children, if you haven't yet, I would encourage you to get your own version of a brain. A human model, slides, photographs, something, and talk with them at a level that they can understand about all of these issues. It gives us all a common language that allows us then, when the misbehavior is occurring, to talk very objectively about some of the science behind that behavior. It allows us to have calm, sometimes intelligent discussions about what's actually happening. It helps us take the blame away from the behavior and bring some insight and understanding to it. Okay? So there are many definitions of executive functioning, and here are just two. What they both have in common is the use of the term self-regulation. So with your permission, let me just read those in case the print is too small to see easily. Executive functioning can be used to refer to brain circuits that prioritize, integrate, and regulate other cognitive functions. They provide the mechanism for self-regulation. Thomas Brown is a psychologist at Yale. This is his quote. We'll come back and talk more about his theory of executive functioning. He's been a great teacher. We also hear from Russell Barkley, another U.S. researcher who's world-renowned in terms of his knowledge about ADHD. Barkley, for many years, was at the University of Massachusetts in Worcester. More recently, he was at the South Carolina College of Medicine. They're both just brilliant, and I've had the great privilege of hearing both of them speak several times, and they've taught us all a great deal. Barkley's definition is that each component of executive functioning is a type of self-regulation or a self-directed action intended to alter a later consequence, such as achieving a goal. So again, what is executive functioning? It's our brain's ability to identify a goal that we have to accomplish over time, and it's that ability to figure out what is the best way for me to behave over time as I approach that goal. That sounds very simple, but for all of us, and particularly if we have LD or ADHD, that simple act of clarifying a goal, remembering what it was we were trying to accomplish, understanding how to work toward it over time, knowing how to start and stop and start again if it's a goal that's going to take several days to accomplish. That's the critically difficult thing for many students with executive functioning disorder. As we'll see, they often have a hard time getting started. They certainly often have a hard time sustaining their effort over time. They get distracted even if they were initially motivated by the goal. They lose interest. They get involved in other things, and we're having to say, weren't you working on this project? When are you going to start that up again? I completely forgot about that. Thank you so much for reminding me. So self-regulation, in a way, is a synonym, another term for executive functioning. So we're going to be talking a lot about self-regulation as we continue here. So again, this executive functioning concept is really just about the brain's ability to be in charge of itself. Most of the cognitive activity that we refer to when we talk about executive functioning, again, is occurring in the frontal lobes. That's the last area of the brain for all of us to develop well. For students, people with LD and ADHD, that's also the part of the brain where the production of neurochemicals that allows that part of the brain to function fully and efficiently, that production of neurochemicals is underproducing. There's a deficit in the amount of neurochemicals that are available to that part of the brain. So that helps us understand what some of the difficulty is. When we're able, though, to engage in good executive functioning, we're able to do the sorts of things that, again, schools want us to be able to do well. Schools aren't always able to teach us how to do that, But as we get older, we're expected to do that, right? So I know in many countries, including the US, as students transition from elementary school to high school, there is a great increase in the amount of independence those students are expected to have. They get much more homework, right? They're given bigger projects to do, 10-page papers, 15-page papers. And what we're really expecting those students to do is to organize themselves, to plan these larger projects, to stay organized. But I want you to be thinking about, and having been a classroom teacher, I say this with great respect, when do schools teach students how to do that? How to organize, how to think well, how to manage themselves? Many students just learn, they just figure it out somehow. Many of the students we're working with don't, unless they receive what's called direct instruction, unless somebody can sit down and teach that student, here's how you keep a calendar, here's how you take notes, here's how you study for that test, okay? Let's talk a little bit now more in greater detail about Dr. Russell Barkley's theory of executive functioning, and then we'll look at Dr. Thomas Brown's. They're very similar. Again, this is relatively recent research and thinking, but the executive functioning view or understanding of LD and ADHD has become in many countries sort of the dominant paradigm, the most helpful way of thinking about this. So Barkley uses this fancy term called disinhibition. And whenever I hear that, I have to separate dis, the prefix, from the root word inhibition. So if I inhibit myself, I stop myself from doing something I might regret later. I might have a thought, but if I realize it could hurt somebody's feeling, I don't say it out loud. I inhibit, I hold back. So disinhibition, dis meaning not, if I have disinhibition, that means I rarely stop myself from doing things that I might regret later. Another word for that is impulsive, right? And we know that lots of students with ADHD and LD can be wildly impulsive. They burn their hands in the fire every time. And they don't seem to learn well from their mistakes. So they're at the fire next week, putting their hand again, and we're going, don't you remember what happened last week? I just got interested in that fire. I wanted to see how hot it was. My hand reached out to it. Disinhibition. So Dr. Barkley says that the part of the brain that inhibits, that gives us all just a tiny second to think about what might happen if I do this, or what might happen if I don't do this, that tiny second of thinking, of reflecting, of planning, is an area of great difficulty for many people with ADHD. They have a thought, they act on it. Impulsive. Now, some people would say that makes them exciting go-getters. They change the world. Many of us know of Sir Richard Branson, the founder of Virgin Airlines and Records. He has ADHD. He has changed the world in many important ways in terms of his business practice. So I'm not saying that it's a bad thing to be impulsive, to have confidence, to have ideas, and to act right away. But if your ideas are not good, if they're not well planned out, if you might hurt somebody's feeling if you say what's in your mind right away, if you're disinhibited, then that can create many more problems in the long run, perhaps, than successes, okay? So Barkley starts with disinhibition and says, because that part of the brain isn't working as well as it should, then the person's ability to use their executive functioning skills in that momentary second of planning is limited. And he talks about 4 specific types of executive functioning, okay? One is working memory, that ability to hold on to and think about information that we've just learned in the last, 30 seconds to 5, 10, 15 minutes. So if you're a classroom teacher and you say to the class, students, I want you to open up to page 22. We're going to read from that page. My working memory has to hold on to, we're getting out which book? We're turning to which page? Which section of that page are we looking at? I'm seeing some of you look at each other and smile and nod. Some of your students' working memory doesn't serve them well in those situations. So if I'm the 12-year-old with ADHD and my working memory lost that information, or I was distracted by a sound outside the window and didn't hear it in the first place, if I have good inhibition, I'm going to sit there and quietly watch what page the other students turn to so that I can turn to the right page and not be noticed. What do our students do? Right. Exactly. And so everybody in the room, starting with us, knows they weren't paying attention, their working memory didn't serve them well, they can't quietly correct their behavior, so we're all going to have to stop and be aware of that, okay? And it happens again and again and again. So it's also logical for us to think of that student, well, when I give directions, surely you've figured out by now that you need to listen so that you'll know what page to turn to. And again, our students tend not to learn so much from their mistakes, from their experiences. They tend to repeat them, okay? So working memory is one of those areas, according to Barkley, that is underdeveloped in people with ADHD. We're going to talk later about internalized speech, which is also called self-talk, or verbal working memory, our brain's ability to talk to us silently in our heads to organize and guide our behavior. When I was listening to Dr. Guire, a lot of what he said was speaking to me about that emotional dysregulation is either the absence of the ability to sort of coach ourselves through a difficult emotional situation, or an abundance of negative internalized speech that's making us very worried about how things are going to turn out. I mean, when you think about anxiety, really, anxiety is our brain's voice telling us that something terrible is going to happen that we have no control over. Who wouldn't feel very anxious if that's what you were saying to yourself? So this is an area that's also affected. Problem solving, figuring things out, that's difficult in people with ADHD, again, because of this disinhibition, but also regulation of affect, which means emotional regulation, keeping yourselves calm. This is Dr. Thomas Brown's model. If you Google Thomas Brown, you'll go to his website, and he has a great deal of information, lots of readings and articles. Just thomasbrown.com, I believe it is, but just Google Thomas Brown. And he makes a lot of his information freely available on the internet. Barkley, in my experience, the first researcher, very cerebral. I call him Moses. He just has this grand, sort of towering authority. He's brilliant. He remembers everything that he reads. I was nervous when I had the chance to meet him for the first time because I thought, what could I possibly say that would be of interest to such a brilliant man? Dr. Brown, on the other hand, is less of a researcher, more of a practitioner. He's very interested in what can we do to help these students. But they make a nice combination. Barkley really helps us understand the brain and theory. Dr. Brown really helps us understand what we can do about it. So I would encourage you to maybe read both, depending on what your interests are. Whereas I think of a stoplight when I'm thinking of Barkley's view, because that red light initially doesn't go off easily and quickly in the brains of people with ADHD, so the traffic isn't stopping. All the incoming stimulation in my mind and all the stimulation in the world around me, if I have ADHD, is just trying to rush through that same intersection all at the same time. So Barkley makes us think about the lack of a traffic policeman out in the intersection. If we have that traffic policeman there directing traffic, inhibiting, stop, wait, that's not what we're working on right now, hold on to that thought in your working memory, we'll come back to that later. Right now I need to finish my math problems. Barkley helps us say, gosh, this person doesn't have a very good traffic police person in their mind to stop all of that. So they're constantly being flooded with lots of information that they want to quickly act upon. Dr. Brown, on the other hand, his metaphor is a symphony conductor. And he says when you think about a symphony, that person has good executive functioning. All the parts of their brain are working well together. When we need to hear from the wind section, the other sections quiet down. They take their turn. And then the horn section maybe starts to play again. And we have this lovely integrated orchestra piece. But again, according to Dr. Brown, in the minds of people with LD and ADHD, people with executive functioning problems, their symphony conductor is often not at the podium. They're not very effective in starting and stopping some of the different thoughts and patterns of thinking that we're engaged in. But both of them speak to emotional regulation as one of the executive functions. So when we talk about executive functioning, we're talking about cognitive issues, how we think. We're talking about emotional issues, how we feel. And then we're talking about behavioral issues, what other people in the room see us doing based on this discord that's often in our mind. Okay? So a great quote here from a book I'd recommend called The Developing Mind, which is really all about executive functioning, not specific to people with LD or ADHD, but still a very good background. Dr. Siegel has this quote, "Emotions direct the flow of activation and establish the meaning of representation for the individual." So again, we know that emotions are very much connected to what we're talking about now. So I hope Dr. Aguirre's talk and mine sort of dovetail in that regard. I found this image and many other incredibly helpful pieces of information on the KALD website. So with your permission, I stole it and wanted to share it with you today. But I thought it was just a great way of helping us really think about this concept visually. Before the development of executive functioning theory, so as recently as the 1990s, when we thought about LD and ADHD, we only thought of the tip of the iceberg. We saw impulsivity, hyperactivity, inattention. Those of you who are familiar with the DSM-4, the DSM-5 handbook for making diagnoses like LD and ADHD, we know that in the DSM, that model is all about the tip of the iceberg. We're taught to look for symptoms of inattention, hyperactivity, impulsivity, and when we see enough of those in many settings, we can clinically begin to diagnose ADHD. But what people like Dr. Brown and Dr. Barkley said was, why? What's causing that? What's going on underneath the surface of the water? And that's where their research about executive functioning has helped us understand the mechanisms of the brain that cause those surface behaviors that we see and are often very frustrated with, again. So again, for me as a clinician, as an educator, what I try and do is share that information with each student I work with at whatever level of language and complexity that they can handle. I also share it with their parents and give them readings about executive functioning, starting with a wonderful one that Dr. Brown has on his website where he talks about the orchestra conductor. And parents often read it. It's 4 or 5 pages. It's very easy to read. And they come back and they say, this helped me understand my son or my daughter very clearly. Gosh, a lot of their behaviors are not designed to drive me crazy and make me angry. They're doing the best that they can. So starting with information, we can educate people. So let's talk a little bit more specifically now about ADHD, one particular type of executive function. And I have a couple of images here. One is a young woman, and one is a cover of a book called Understanding Women with ADHD. How many of you are familiar with the work of Dr. Patricia Quinn, Dr. Kathleen Nadeau? They're the co-authors of the book in the upper right-hand corner. Dr. Quinn is a developmental pediatrician in Washington, D.C., and Dr. Nadeau, Kathleen Nadeau, is a psychologist in Bethesda, Maryland, their colleagues. They have pioneered a great deal of research about girls and women with ADHD. And we're very appreciative of their work because nobody else was doing that. The problem is that as DSM and other international publications began to teach us about ADHD, they were only studying boys with ADHD. Sadly, that often happens in a great deal of research. I'm seeing some of you nod your head, so you know about that. While that's helpful to better understand the classically ADHD boy, the very hyperactive boy who can't sit still, who runs around the room, it often doesn't help us understand the girl in the classroom with ADHD. Because we know that there are really 3 subtypes of ADHD. There is that hyperactive impulsive type, and that child, everybody knows they have ADHD. Their behaviors are constant, they're acting out, we're aware of them. But the second subtype of ADHD, inattentive, is much harder to spot. And for reasons nobody understands well yet, girls and women tend to have the inattentive type more often than the hyperactive impulsive type. So these are girls, usually, sometimes boys, who are very quiet, who are often raised to be very polite, who maybe like some of you right now are very politely looking, nodding, smiling, and your mind is a million miles away. And I don't take that personally. It's late in the day and you've been sitting and listening all day. You're working hard and I respect that. But people with the inattentive type of ADHD are often not identified until later in their life. They don't cause problems in the classroom. They're not referred for testing. Sadly, their parents are often told when they don't get very good grades, you know, she's just not that smart. Well, it's often the case that she's very smart, but her brain is also struggling with disinhibition. She's often having so many internal distractions and thoughts and worries that she misses half of what her teachers say, even though on the outside, we think she's paying very close attention. So we're really perplexed when there's this chronic pattern that disconnects the intelligence that we see in her and her grades. And we find that if we talk to her in person, she's very smart. She can tell us a lot. And then we give her her exam, and she misses half the questions. What's going on? So people like Dr. Nadeau and Dr. Quinn have taught us a great deal about recognizing ADHD in girls often. Although, again, I certainly work with a number of males who have the inattentive type as well. Okay? In general, what I've learned to do when I know or suspect that they have that type of ADHD is talk very a short amount of time and stop and engage them in conversation. And I'll say, in your own words, can you summarize what I just shared with you? And oftentimes I'll get a very awkward look from the student who in their head is saying, absolutely not. He just caught me. I have no idea what he just talked about. And again, educationally, I get the brain back out and I say,